My name is reprehensible, and you're listening to the Invisible Hand Podcast. The world's ran by human nature, self-interest, and power. Let's get into it. Hey, what's going on, everybody? My name is reprehensible, and today we're going to be talking about a video by Jordan Peterson where he said the ideal of white privilege is reprehensible. So I'm going to have a defense for that. I don't agree, because basically what he was saying in this video is that white privilege is reprehensible, meaning that it doesn't really exist in the way in which the people who make the argument about white privilege make it. And so in this video, I'm going to break down how the ideal of white privilege does exist, and the way in which Jordan Peterson explains it actually is kind of disingenuous because it's changing the meaning. I'm also going to explain how he's using misdirection to change the claim in the meaning of white privilege. I'm also going to talk about how the tyranny of majority that exists by white people being the dominant race in the country is a form of white privilege in itself. It's actually the fundamental definition of it. And then I'm going to also talk about collective guilt, because he mentioned in the video about collective guilt and how white privilege is a claim to collective guilt. And I'm going to show how that's fundamentally different. Let's get into the video.
You know, I think the idea of white privilege is absolutely reprehensible. And it's not because white people aren't privileged. You know, we have all sorts of privileges, and most people have privileges of all sorts, and you should be grateful for your privileges and work to deserve them, I would say. But the idea that you can target an ethnic group with a collective crime, regardless of the specific innocence or guilt of the constituent elements of that group, there is absolutely nothing that's more racist than that. It's absolutely abhorrent. I can't... Yeah. I mean, if you really want to know more about that sort of thing, you should read about the kulaks in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, K-U-L-A-K-S, because they were farmers who were very productive. They were the most productive element of the agricultural strata in Russia, and they were virtually all killed or raped and robbed by the collectivists, who insisted that because they showed signs of wealth, they were criminals and robbers. So, and one of the consequences of the prosecution of the kulaks was the death of 6 million Ukrainians from a famine in the 1930s. The idea of collectively held guilt at the level of the individual as a legal or philosophical principle is dangerous. It's precisely the sort of danger that people who are really looking for trouble would push. So, and just a cursory glance at 20th century history should teach anyone who wants to know exactly how unacceptable that is.
So let's start off with the first point that Jordan Peterson makes, which is the ideal of white privilege is reprehensible. And he explains that it's reprehensible because it's essentially collective guilt. And so my argument is, number one, white privilege and collective guilt are two separate things that he's connecting in order to make his argument coherent. I'll give you an example. What people are really talking about when they talk about white privilege, what they're actually talking about is an unfair advantage. That means that white people are privileged and they have certain advantages because of their numbers and their access and control of wealth. Now, in order to acknowledge that they have an advantage, you have to know the historical evidence of how they got that advantage. Now, whether you want to look at it or not, for over 300 to 400 years, white Americans had the opportunity, certain capitalists of power had the opportunity to accumulate a lot of wealth off of the work of slaves. From there, they created cotton, which created industries, which ultimately led to capital. Fast forward 400 years, you have JP Morgan, you have oil companies, you have very rich families that control finance that basically manifest into the industries we have today. So the unfair advantage was gained a long time ago, and we're just happen to be living in the framework of modern day America. So when we talk about white privilege, we're talking about that unfair advantage that was gained 400 years ago that slowly manifested itself into the disproportionate wealth we have today. Now, any historian or anybody of any decent intellect knows that exists. Now that we arrived at that, it is a privilege to be white living in a framework like that if you're smart and intelligent and competent. So we're assuming that the people who are privileged are average or of higher intelligence, who know how to navigate the world, go to school, get a degree, etc., right? It's a privilege to operate in that system. Why? Now we're making a second assumption. You're saying, well, that's not really a privilege. Here's why it is. And the central theme of it, why it's a privilege, is because the tyranny of majority. Now, the founders of this country knew that even though democracy is a great system, probably one of the best that ever been created, it has a fundamental flaw that they talk about called tyranny of majority. Let me tell you what that is. The tyranny of the majority, or the tyranny of the masses. White people are the dominant population in this country, and throughout history in this country, they have been the largest population, even though that's changing now, right? So tyranny of majority, the tyranny of the masses, is a situation that can result from a system of majority rule wherein the majority group places its own interests above the interests of the minority group without consideration for their welfare or rights or their minority. In a direct democracy, for example, this form of oppression could involve the majority using the democratic process to shape public policy solely for their own interests, including minority groups from distributions of benefits. So now, the framers of the Constitution knew this, and that's why they separated three branches of government. However, the manifestation of disproportionate power or the tyranny of the majority doesn't come through the democratic process. It comes through natural human nature. It manifests itself in the gray areas. For instance, if the majority of the capital and companies are created by white people and funded by white people, and the CEO and the managers are all white, and it's tired to hire other managers, this is not something that's covered in the democratic framework of democracy. It is human nature for people to act in their own self-interest and work with people who look like them, come from their same group, and have their same interests at hand. So if I'm a manager, I'm going to most of the time hire somebody who's competent, but also somebody who's closer to my group because it represents power. This is human nature. Black people would do the same thing. Asian people would do the same thing. Hispanic people would do the same thing. Now, the reason why this is not acknowledged, why white privilege exists, is because Americans, especially white Americans, want us to all believe that in the democratic ethos or creed, which is a democratic process is fair. And if we all believe in America and we all believe in the fairness of the country, then we must believe that when people are hired, they're hired based on their skills. They're hired on because they're the best candidate and not because of nepotism. But what supersedes this created democratic process, this ethos of America and democracy, is human nature. And human nature says people tend to act in their own self-interest. For instance, the nuclear family. That is my original born self-interest. I'm going to do what's best for me, my brother, my sister, my mom, my dad. And if I have cousins, I'll do what's best for them. And if I have cousins or friends of the family, I'll do what's best for them. And then if I have people who live in my community who tend to be my same group or race, I'll do what's best for them. And if I have any room left over, I'll help out other groups. That's human nature acting out in its most natural form. Now, the issue is when people bring this argument to the table, when we present it, that white privilege exists, I don't really like the word white privilege. I believe more white advantage. Why do they have an advantage? Because all the capital and all the businesses and all the places of power in this country are owned by them. How did they get that advantage? Well, we got to go back to the history of the country. They had an unfair advantage because they had free labor for over 400 years that manifested itself into the system today. So do you have an advantage being white given all other things equal? That means we have two kids graduating from Harvard, both have skills, and they go to the same company. Now, one's white, one's black, they're just as smart and just as talented and just as capable. The probability, based on human nature, that white kid ends up CEO compared to the black kid is significantly higher, given how human beings naturally act. That's the gray areas of human nature that's not addressed by the framework of the Constitution. That's human beings acting in their self-interest. Now, given that white people control the majority of businesses, jobs, capital, political positions, then if you're white and capable, you have an advantage. That's what we mean by white privilege. For any intelligent intellectual to deny the examples I just laid out to you today is disingenuous. Now, let's get back to the beginning of the video. Jordan Peterson stated that white privilege is a bad framework to look at the world and you cannot implement it into law. In that point, I do agree with him. He is right. It is not a philosophical, ideological, or government system that can be implemented on top of a scaffolding of an ideology. So we can't run around the world saying you have privilege, I don't, and build laws around it. He's 100% right. The part about this video I disagree with when it comes to Jordan Peterson is how he tried to conflate white privilege, which is white people, because they're the majority, have a competitive advantage because they already control the resources, and given human nature, most of the time people who are in power do what's best for them. So if you're white and you're capable, you have a higher probability of success given it's in your favor. He's trying to switch what white privilege is and turn it into an ideological conflation of what collective guilt is. From there, he took collective guilt and then manifested and connected it to collectivism. Then he took collectivism, which was happening in the Soviet Union, that led to Stalin killing millions of people. And so now he took the word white privilege, which is acknowledging white people have an advantage given the history of this country, and he conflated it with collective guilt. Then he conflated collective guilt with millions of people getting killed by Stalin Russia. So now what he's saying is, if you acknowledge that white people have an advantage in this country, you're the same person, or you have the same ideology as somebody who could end up killing millions of people. You see how he made several ideological jumps from the original premise? And he was able to do that by reframing the conversation and changing the true nature and definition of what actual white privilege is. White privilege is the tyranny of majority, but not the tyranny of majority that's written into the democratic principles when it comes to separating the branches of government. It's the tyranny of the natural majority and acting out in human nature. Human beings do what's best for them. So as long as white people control the majority of jobs, capital, etc., they're going to do what's best for them first, and then you get what's left over. And that's what white privilege is. But let me back up once again. Jordan Peterson is right. We cannot run around using white privilege as a political ideology. It's not a framework in which to see the world, nor is it a framework in order to implement law. So from that perspective, Jordan Peterson is correct. If they're using it that way, then it is collectivist thinking, and it could lead us down a bad path. So I just wanted to delineate that what white privilege truly is just acknowledging that there are systems in place given the fact that human beings act in a certain way, which is tend to be in their self-interest, that we must look at these things if you want us to continue to agree to operate in the framework of democracy. Understand one thing in America. There's different races and different groups and different interests. And we all are actively agreeing to continue this system of operating within the law and the confines of the democratic process. But it's only our willingness to agree in this process that keep this country going. And if they're not willing to look at these grievances about how the unfair advantage, given the nature of how human beings act, that we're not going to be able to collectively as a group catch up or compete competitively, given what we know about human nature and how human beings tend to do things in their self-interest. If America is not eventually willing to acknowledge that this white advantage exists, and make sure that they actually put things in place to make sure that we have a chance, then at some point, African Americans and other groups are saying, I no longer believe in the system, I no longer want to participate, and that's how revolutions start. If you keep denying the unfair advantage that exists in your system, eventually we're gonna stop agreeing to adhere by the rules, and that's how revolution starts. So I hope all of this is informative. I do like Jordan Peterson, but I think that he's a little blindsided by his ideological points to see why constructing an ideological argument about white privilege or white advantage and connecting it to collectivism could be slightly disingenuous and misleading. My name is Arafat Shabazz, and you've been watching the Invisible Hand Podcast.
The future of legal betting is finally here. Place a bet using Bitcoin right over the phone. Unlike traditional gambling sites, every bet you make with us is guaranteed a 50% probability of winning. All of our bets are one-on-one against a real person and never the house. We offer some of the most unique bets in the industry. Bets like, will LeBron James win his 5th NBA title? Will Joe Biden be elected for a 2nd term? Will Tesla be worth $1 trillion by the end of 2022? You can bet on if it'll rain tomorrow. You can literally bet on any future event. Text the phrase I bet to the number in the description and I'll reply back with all of our available bets. Again, text the phrase I bet to the number in the description and I'll reply back with all of our available bets today.